Have you ever noticed how your heart races when someone tries to truly see you? Not the version you present to the world, but the real you beneath all those carefully constructed layers. That sudden urge to run, to create distance, to sabotage the very connection you thought you wanted. The answer isn't fear of intimacy, commitment issues, or past relationship trauma. It lies in something more primordial, more deeply embedded in your psyche, something that deconstructs everything we were taught about human connection. Because when you panic as someone gets close, you aren't being difficult. You're protecting yourself. And that kind of self-protection doesn't come with explanations, apologies, or rational thinking. It comes with quickened breath, a pounding heart, and a kind of primal fear most people still don't understand. No, you're not broken. You're human. You're not cold. You just unconsciously remember what it felt like to be seen too deeply and hurt too profoundly. There's something profoundly threatening about allowing someone complete access to your inner world, because that shatters the walls of protection, dismantles the fortresses of emotional safety, and reveals a brutal truth. Most people don't know what to do with the full weight of another's psyche, and most of us are still learning to recognize ourselves in that silent yet deafening mirror of vulnerability. Freud once said that everything we repress becomes part of our unconscious, and this panic when someone gets too close is actually a manifestation of the collective unconscious at work. It's what many experience but few have the courage to acknowledge. They don't articulate their fears, they act them out. They don't discuss their need for emotional safety. They create chaos to ensure distance. They're less interested in explaining themselves and more in preserving their core self. And that makes relationships complicated. Because while the world demands openness and vulnerability, these deeper parts of us have discovered the power of staying hidden. The person who panics when someone gets too close isn't dysfunctional. They're operating on a different level, a level where nothing is freely given. It's earned, where trust isn't assumed, presence must be proven. And maybe that's why it sparks so much confusion, so much frustration, so many attempts to label or diagnose them. But what many still don't understand is that behind their apparent resistance is a depth that overwhelms, that challenges the emotional status quo. They don't want just any kind of closeness. They want something that doesn't threaten their core self. And until that feels safe, they stand guarded, vigilant, protected. Maybe you don't get it right now. Maybe you think it's irrational, dramatic, or emotional damage in disguise. But deep down, way deep down, there's a question inside you. A quiet one that pulses even when you try to ignore it. What if that protective response is actually the wisest part of you, trying to prevent the repetition of ancient wounds? The wall that surrounds someone who fears true closeness is not rejection, it's a boundary. And those who don't understand the necessity of that boundary often call them avoidant, fearful, or even emotionally stunted. But what few people see is that they didn't build that fortress to shut love out. They built it to not lose themselves. Freud also theorized that repression is the mind's way of keeping us functional, of pushing down what we cannot yet face. And maybe that's why so many still confuse self-protection with fear, when in reality, it can be the instinctive wisdom of the unconscious. While most people look to connect through continuous exposure, this person knows the value of sacred distance. And there, in the vastness of their own unconscious, they've stored the ghosts they couldn't face in real time. Childhood wounds, unspoken violations, intimacies that became intrusions. Their decision to keep people at arm's length didn't come from an arbitrary fear, but from a system that finally learned to protect itself. They didn't stop believing in love. They just stopped accepting what others called love when it only made them feel invaded. This person knows vulnerability. They've opened themselves completely. They've given too much access. They've allowed others into spaces within themselves that should have remained private until trust was truly established. But at some point, they woke up. And that awakening wasn't sudden. It was a series of violations that stopped hurting and started teaching. What you see now isn't coldness. It's psychological maturity. And maturity is scary because it demands boundaries, depth, and truth. They don't want just any intimacy. They want earned trust. They're no longer attracted to fast-forwarded closeness, but to gradual revelation. So maybe that's why they seem unreachable to many. Because they don't want to be invaded. They want to be approached. And that takes more than charm or intense declarations. It takes patience to honor the pace where few are willing to wait. And that's where many give up. Not because they're difficult, but because they're deep. And when a person honors their own depth, they awaken two extremes in the world: admiration and frustration. Admiration from those who are also seeking that authentic connection. Frustration from those who still want immediate access, expecting everyone to be available on demand. They don't want to perform intimacy. They want to experience it authentically. Until then, they keep their distance, not by fate's whim, but out of loyalty to their own soul. This person isn't rejecting others. They're honoring themselves. There's a vast difference between pushing people away and maintaining appropriate boundaries. But the world doesn't easily accept a person like this. A world that still equates love with complete access. A world that still sees privacy as secrecy, as something to overcome rather than respect. Freud once said that where the repressed lives, there's no reasoning. And this person doesn't navigate relationships by societal logic. They navigate by internal wisdom. They hear phrases like, "Why won't you let me in? Why are you so guarded? Nobody can love you if you don't open up." And they smile, a calm, steady, almost ironic smile, because they know what many call walls are simply the necessary gates. The gates it took them decades to realize they have every right to guard. They're not looking for invasion. They're looking for someone mature enough to love without demanding. Someone who's done the inner work they have already faced. And let's be honest, that's not something you find on just any dating app. The discomfort they cause isn't in what they say, it's in what they represent. They're living proof that it's possible to maintain yourself while still connecting deeply. And that tears masks off. Partners who feed on emotional merging feel threatened. People still trapped in the need for constant access feel judged. But they aren't here to confront anyone. They're just being. And the authenticity of someone who has freed themselves from the obligation to be emotionally available on command is by itself a brutal mirror to those still living by those expectations. This person isn't in a hurry. They don't need to rush intimacy to please anyone. They respect their own timing. And for that, they stir a silent fury in a society that wants everything now. They want authentic connection while the world chases intensity mistaken for depth. They want earned trust while the world offers only performance. They long for soul-level bonds while everyone else is trying to forge connections through premature vulnerability on the next social platform. And when they say no, it's not a game, it's truth. When they create distance, it's not rejection, it's self-respect. When they choose to keep parts of themselves private instead of merging completely with someone new, it's not fear, it's wisdom. And that wisdom earned through pain and surrender is their greatest revolution. Because they don't live to please, they live to be. And that simple act, being, is what makes them so dangerous to a system built on emotional compliance. Perhaps what unsettles people most about this person isn't their guardedness. It's the integrity they've found within themselves. Freud taught that civilization requires the repression of instincts. But what happens when those instincts are precisely what's needed to navigate human connection? It was precisely that question that they faced. It wasn't easy. It was a grueling process of deconstructing social expectations, facing the ghosts of emotional invasion, and rebuilding themselves piece by piece. They no longer define connection through the expectations of others. They experience it through their own truth. And that changes everything. How many times have you wondered if your instinct to pull back is dysfunction or self-preservation? How many times have you felt the need to justify yourself for not wanting someone to have complete access to your inner world? This person has felt that too. They once thought there was something wrong with them for feeling suffocated in relationships where boundaries weren't respected. But one day they understood it's better to be alone than to be psychologically invaded in a relationship. And that day, they made a pact with themselves. Never again would they override their own instincts about who deserves access to their depths. Their path is not a straight line. There are days of doubt, moments of loneliness, nights of wondering if they're asking too much, but there's also a strength that grows with each boundary honored in awareness. They learned that true love doesn't force, doesn't demand, doesn't invade. The love they want is the kind that respects, that earns trust, that approaches without entitlement. And until that love arrives, they choose to keep themselves intact, not out of fear, but out of integrity. This person is the living embodiment of Freud's theory that what we repress eventually returns. But in their case, what returned wasn't just repressed trauma, but repressed wisdom. They broke, faced their unconscious, descended into the psychological underworld, and returned more whole than ever. And now that they recognize their own value, they refuse to be psychologically invaded again. They don't want someone to overcome their boundaries. They want someone to honor them. That's intimidating because it demands emotional intelligence. And sadly, few are willing to love intelligently. Most still love out of need, out of compulsion, out of entitlement. And if they maintain distance today, it's because every boundary echoes with learning. Every limit they set is an act of self-respect. Every withdrawal they initiate is a reminder that love should never feel like invasion. They no longer need to explain their pace to anyone. And that certainty, born from the deepest part of their soul, transforms everything around them. Because a person who has reclaimed their right to psychological privacy becomes empowered, not because of their walls, but because of their discernment. The person who panics when someone gets too close is not the same person who once allowed their boundaries to be trampled. Something inside them awakened, and it was precisely that awakening that set them free. Because sometimes, only in reclaiming our right to privacy does the psyche find its new form. Freud used to say that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, and that's exactly what they learned to honor. They reconnected with the wisdom of their own depths, faced archetypal fears, inherited patterns, psychological dynamics that weren't just theirs, but those of all humans who came before them. They broke patterns. They said no to relationships that demanded what they weren't ready to give. They learned that it wasn't their job to override their instincts, compromise their boundaries, or accept invasion out of fear of being alone. And when they stopped accepting less, the world tried to convince them they were too difficult. But they stood their ground, first with uncertainty, then with awareness, and finally with conviction, because someone who has honored their own depths no longer fears judgment. They learn to trust their instincts about closeness, to honor their need for psychological space. They're not unreachable. They simply no longer allow themselves to be invaded. There's a world of difference between allowing connection and surrendering sovereignty. They connect, yes, but only with those who approach with respect, not with entitlement or expectations or demands disguised as needs. They've seen enough to tell the difference between patience and pressure. Their intuition has become sharp. Their energy is a filter. They can sense from afar what lacks depth, and they don't hesitate to create distance. Their transformation isn't superficial, it's archetypal. It's as if they've tapped into an ancient wisdom, an old memory that humans weren't born to surrender their boundaries, but to honor them, not to be consumed, but to be respected. And in accessing that memory, something awakened in them, a psychological sovereignty, emotional wisdom, a person who, though seemingly distant, is far from cold. They're in communion with something greater, with their own truth. And no matter how much they try to label them with pathologies, avoidant, fearful, resistant, nothing sticks because they no longer live to fit diagnostic criteria. They live to honor themselves. They no longer fight for acceptance. They radiate authenticity. They're no longer waiting to be fixed. They do the discerning. And that reversal of logic confuses those who still try to pathologize the need for psychological space. But they're no longer concerned with labels. They've already crossed the threshold. And on the other side, they discovered that real connection begins only after you've respected yourself enough to not need validation for your boundaries. There's something sacred about the way they navigate relationships. They don't need explanations or public affirmation. Their conviction is quiet, and it's in that silence that their true strength lives. Freud said that everything we deny within eventually returns as fate. And perhaps that's why this person, in choosing themselves again and again, has become the author of a destiny that few can understand, but many secretly envy. They no longer try to justify their needs or convince anyone that they deserve respect. They don't apologize for their pace in anyone's life because they've learned that psychological safety should never be compromised. It should be a given, and when that basic respect doesn't come, they simply withdraw. They don't react with arguments or defensiveness. They step away with the dignity of someone who's been invaded too many times to let the same wound happen again. What few people understand is that this person still longs for connection. They still want to be known, understood, loved, but they want it without losing themselves because they've spent too long trying to override instincts too crucial for the soul they carry. Now, they only offer themselves where there's room to be whole. And that requires a level of maturity that goes far beyond romance. It requires awareness. It requires having faced one's own psychological dynamics and still choosing to connect. They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for a soul alliance, a connection where there's no invasion or entitlement, where both can be known by each other without surrendering their right to privacy, silencing their instincts, or compromising their truth. And if that seems too much for some, so be it. Because they'd rather wait than survive on premature intimacy, and to many that sounds like fear, but it's really just self-respect in its purest form. We are witnessing a new understanding of human connection, a way of relating that has walked away from the superficial and dived into the authentic, that got tired of being merely accessed and chose to be respected, that chose to honor instincts not because they gave up on love, but because they began to understand that real love never demands self-denial. And when a person understands that, their whole approach begins to change. They don't need to defend their boundaries to be heard. Their presence speaks before any justifications. Wherever they go, the energy shifts. Like something in the room realigns, subtly but unmistakably. This isn't psychology, it's integrity. It's the weight of someone who has already faced the most brutal inner wars and chose to return in peace. Not because they conquered all their fears, but because they learned to live with them without being defeated. Freud would say they found integration not by eliminating conflict, but by honoring it. This person doesn't reject connection. They've simply learned not to submit to unbalanced relationships, where one must surrender so the other can dominate. They long to connect, but in a love where their boundaries don't need to be justified. A love where they can be both open and sovereign, trusting and discerning, close and separate. Because they realize that those who only love the available parts haven't yet learned what love truly is. And those who demand constant access still don't understand the beauty of earned revelation, so necessary for trust. They're too aware to settle for invasion, too free to accept entitlement disguised as love, too intuitive to endure superficial bonds, and at the same time, strong enough to keep choosing this path. Even when it's misunderstood, even when it's pathologized, even when it's mislabeled. That is the journey of an awakened soul, giving up social approval in exchange for deeper truth. Deep down, the world fears people like them. People who don't comply, people who don't conform, people who refuse to be accessed on demand because they challenge invisible expectations, question old patterns, and break silent psychological contracts that once said, "A person only has worth if they are available to others." And when they break those contracts, when they rewrite their own narrative, they inspire others. And that, for the system, is dangerously revolutionary. So they continue, sometimes with uncertainty in their hearts, sometimes with their boundaries held high, but always with their instincts firmly trusted, because now they know they're not wrong. They're with themselves. And after everything they've lived through, that is more than enough. The love that comes after, that won't be invasion. It will be communion. It won't come to access them. It will come to know them. When a person chooses to honor their own instincts about closeness, the world rushes to convince them they're dysfunctional. But deep down, they feel something aligning within them. It's not resistance or pathology. It's a rare kind of wisdom that can only be born from honoring one's truth. The same wisdom Freud called the return of the repressed, the process of becoming fully conscious of what was once pushed down. And when that happens, nothing outside them has more power than the truth that pulses inside their chest. That truth doesn't need to be defended. It can show itself in the way they quietly create distance without apology, in how they withdraw when the connection no longer feels safe, in the way they hold their boundaries in peace, even with judgment all around them. Because they discovered that honoring their instincts is not dysfunction. It's a vow of loyalty to their own psyche. And the psyche of an awakened person does not submit, does not compromise, does not apologize. It simply is. And that is enough. The world will keep trying to tell them they're asking too much. It will keep offering shallow connections, entitled partners, relationships made for convenience. But they've already seen behind the curtain. They've already understood. It's not about finding just anyone. It's about never betraying yourself again. And when that realization blooms, everything changes. Panic becomes discernment. Fear becomes choice. Withdrawal becomes a path. And what once confused now clarifies. What once threatened now guides. You can feel it deep inside, that stirring, that recognition. Maybe it's a memory, an old pattern, an anxiety that never made sense. Maybe it's the image of a person you once knew, or the person you've become. In either case, something within you is asking to be honored more fully, something that no longer fits in old expectations, something that if you let it, could completely transform how you relate to love, to others, and most importantly, to yourself. That person who panics when someone gets too close is more than just someone who needs therapy. They are a living symbol of psychological liberation. A reminder that it's possible to connect without surrender, without fear, and without needing to justify your pace to anyone. They don't rush ahead of anyone, but they don't compromise either. They carve their own path, unique, inviolable. And along that journey, they light little fires for others who are waking up too. If something inside you was touched by this exploration, maybe it's because deep down you too are ready for a new kind of connection. A connection that begins with honoring yourself. A connection that feeds on respect, patience, and truth. A connection that can't be rushed, demanded, or imposed. And if that connection hasn't come yet, maybe it's because you first needed to become the person who no longer accepts less than you deserve. And if this message found you at the right moment, or awakened something you forgot was living inside you, then I invite you not to keep it to yourself. Share this video with others who need to remember their own right to psychological sovereignty. Like it, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Not out of impulse, but out of recognition. Because when something touches the soul, the least we can do is let it keep resonating within us and through us.